She never pressed send. One message, 4 words. He's going to kill me. Typed in terror, never sent. Found too late on a cracked phone screen, inside a hospital evidence bag, while her sister lay in a coma with a machine breathing for her unborn baby. Grant Ashford was worth $200 million. He had the mayor on speed dial. He had already made other women disappear. The police had closed the case. The doctors stayed quiet. The system? It worked for him. But he forgot one thing. He forgot about the sister he had erased from Meredith's life 6 years ago, the one he thought was gone for good. The forensic investigator who didn't cry at crime scenes, she studied them. And the moment Sloane read those 4 words on that broken screen, she stopped being a grieving sister. She became something Grant Ashford had never faced before. Lesson line: sometimes the person a predator forgets about is the exact person who destroys him. If this story hits you in the chest the way it hits us, drop a comment below. Tell us, would you have had the courage to do what Sloane did? Subscribe and hit the bell because every week we bring you stories about ordinary women who refuse to stay silent. This one, you'll want to hear every single word.
This victory wasn't won with a single battle, but with a relentless war waged in the shadows. It began when Sloane, a forensic investigator who found secrets powerful men buried, pieced together the truth from a cracked phone screen. An unsent message, a digital ghost crying out, "He's going to kill me." Grant Ashford, with his money and friends in high places, had made women vanish before. But he had never faced a sister who refused to let hers be next. He never faced a woman who had stopped being afraid and turned his perfect life into a living hell. The war started the moment Sloane stepped off the plane at Bradley International and walked into Hartford Memorial Hospital. Seeing Meredith lying there, broken and silent, a life support machine breathing for her and her unborn child, transformed Sloane's grief into cold, unbreakable resolve. The story of a simple fall, of a clumsy accident, never sat right in her bones. She was listed as the emergency contact, a connection Grant had overlooked, a detail that would become his undoing. It was there, in the quiet hum of the ICU, that she made her silent vow. It all began with a call that shattered the night at 3:17 in the morning. Sloane knew, even before answering, the way you know a storm is coming. The voice on the other end was professional, trained to deliver catastrophic news calmly. "Miss Callahan? This is Nurse Patricia Hayes. There was an accident. Your sister fell." The word "fell" hung in the air, a lie so blatant it was deafening. She was in a coma, the nurse explained, with a traumatic brain injury. And she was 7 months pregnant. 12 hours before that phone call, Meredith Ashford was stirring risotto in a kitchen that gleamed with marble and steel. Her body ached with the unfamiliar weight of her pregnancy. Then came the sound of Grant's Mercedes, the slam of the door, and the heavy, deliberate footsteps she had learned to read like a weather forecast. Tonight they warned of a storm. "Don't," he'd said, his voice flat and cold as he crossed the kitchen, his hand grabbing her wrist until she felt the bones grind. "Don't pretend you don't know what happened." He smelled of whiskey and rage, accusing her of talking to his brother, of turning his family against him. Her pleas, her denials, her reminders about the baby meant nothing. The first slap snapped her head to the side, the taste of blood sharp in her mouth. The second was a closed fist to her temple that sent the world tilting. He called her stupid, pathetic. He told her he had given her everything, this house, this life. He screamed about betrayal as she tried to protect the fluttering life inside her. Her only thought was escape. She ran for the main hallway, for the front door, for any chance of safety. But he was faster. He caught her at the top of the grand staircase. His eyes wild and empty, he spun her around. "Where do you think you're going?" he snarled, and then he pushed. It wasn't a violent shove. Grant was always too careful for that. It was just enough force, just enough to send her off balance, to let gravity do the rest. The world became a tumbling kaleidoscope of pain as she hit the railing, then the steps, over and over, trying to shield her stomach. She landed in a heap on the marble floor below, staring up at the cold, beautiful crystals of the chandelier. She couldn't breathe. Through the haze, his face appeared above her, the rage already replaced by cold calculation, then by feigned concern. "Look what you made me do," he said softly. "You should have been more careful." As darkness swallowed her vision, the last thing she heard was his smooth, controlled voice on the phone with 911. "My wife fell down the stairs. Please hurry. She's pregnant." It was the perfect story, told by the perfect husband, a story no one would have questioned if it weren't for the sister he'd forgotten about, the one who hadn't spoken to Meredith in 6 years, not since she chose Grant over her own family after their mother's funeral. The sister who always knew the man was a monster, and no one ever saw the monster because he hid so well. He hid behind a fairy tale that began 8 years ago. Meredith was just 24, fresh out of grad school, working at a nonprofit. The irony was devastating. She was helping domestic violence survivors. At a charity gala, she met Grant Ashford, 32, handsome, powerful, and worth more than she could imagine. He swept her off her feet with a life she'd only dreamed of, a man who smiled like he was counting his assets and looked at her like she was his newest, most prized acquisition. The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed the breaking of a long silence. Grant Ashford stood motionless, his perfect suit now a symbol of his hollow core. Sloane watched, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, as the man who had shattered her sister's life was finally led away in handcuffs. Beside her, Meredith squeezed her hand, her own eyes clear and steady for the first time in years. This victory hadn't been won in a day. It was the culmination of a quiet, fierce battle waged in hushed hospital corridors and late-night strategy sessions. It had all come down to a promise whispered over the rhythmic beeping of machines. The case had hinged on a single, unsent text message, a digital cry for help that Sloane had discovered on Meredith's cracked phone. "He's going to kill me," it read, a chilling prophecy that the prosecution presented as undeniable proof of intent. But the foundation of their case was built on the quiet courage of Dr. Rebecca Thornton. On the stand, she meticulously detailed the pattern of injuries, the healed fractures, and old bruises that told a story completely at odds with a simple fall. Her testimony painted a picture not of an accident, but of a sustained campaign of terror, dismantling Grant's facade of the devoted, grieving husband, piece by damning piece. Their alliance had been forged in a small, sterile consultation room, away from Grant Ashford's watchful eyes. "Your sister's injuries are consistent with a fall," Dr. Thornton had said, her gaze sharp and meaningful. "But there are older ones." She never explicitly accused Grant, but her words were a carefully laid map for Sloane. "Without your sister's testimony, there's nothing I can report," she'd stated, a clear signal that the medical file was a treasure trove of evidence waiting for someone with the standing to use it. The doctor had seen this horror before, and this time she was subtly arming the person who could finally end it. That first night in the ICU felt like a lifetime ago. Sloane had pushed past Grant, her focus solely on the broken figure in the bed. Meredith was a tapestry of tubes and wires, her face swollen and bruised, a machine breathing for her. Holding her sister's cold hand, listening to the dual heartbeat of mother and child on the monitor, Sloane felt a rage so pure it burned. She saw Meredith's fingernails, bitten to the quick, and remembered the teenage girl who painted them perfectly every Sunday. That's when she saw the plastic bag of patient belongings and found the phone. The key that would unlock the truth. The words on the cracked screen blurred through her tears. Sloan, I need help. I should have listened to you. He's going to kill me. The message, time-stamped from the night of the incident, confirmed every dark suspicion. Looking at her sister, truly seeing the faint, old scars on her forearms for the first time, Sloan realized this wasn't a single act of violence. It was the brutal climax of years of abuse Grant had hidden behind a mask of charm and wealth. He hadn't just hurt her, he had been systematically destroying her. In that moment, a promise was made. Leaning down to kiss her sister's forehead, Sloan whispered, I'm going to make him pay. The vows settled deep in her bones, a cold, hard certainty. She placed the phone carefully back into the evidence bag. Her grief was overshadowed by a sudden, sharp clarity. She wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and walked out of that room not just as a sister, but as an avenger. Across the waiting area, Grant Ashford sat scrolling on his phone, performing his role as the worried husband, completely oblivious to the fact that his world was about to be torn apart. Before that, there was only the suffocating tension of the waiting room. Dr. Thornton had entered, her face a mask of professional exhaustion, and delivered the grim news of the medically induced coma. The next 72 hours will be critical, she'd said. Grant had played his part perfectly, his voice cracking on cue as he asked about his wife and unborn child. He was the picture of concern, the wealthy husband promising to spare no expense. It was a flicker of recognition in the doctor's eyes when she turned to Sloan that changed everything. And you are? She'd asked, and upon hearing she was Meredith's sister, requested a private word. Grant had tried to object, insisting he, as the husband, should be present. But Dr. Thornton was firm, citing hospital policy as she steered Sloan down the hall, away from his poisonous influence and toward the first whisper of the truth. In that small office, the doctor had laid out the facts like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The official report said a fall down the stairs. The police had closed the case, but the medical evidence, the scarring, the patterns of old bruising, suggested something far more sinister. I'm saying the injuries are consistent with a fall, she repeated, her eyes locking with Sloane's. Do you understand what I'm telling you? In that moment, Sloan understood perfectly. The system was designed to protect men like Grant, but the doctor was offering her a way to fight back. And it all started in a visitor parking lot outside a hospital that felt like a concrete fortress. Sloan sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at a worn photograph from her wallet. Two little girls in matching sundresses, grinning. She was 10, Meredith was 8. So innocent, before their lives were poisoned by their father's rage, their mother's silence, and finally, by Grant Ashford. Tracing her sister's smiling face, Sloan whispered, I'm here, Mir. I'm here now. It was a promise she had no idea how she would keep. But as she got out of the car and walked toward the sliding glass doors, she knew she wouldn't leave until justice was done. Meredith's eyes were open, and they were clear. Sloan watched as her sister finally woke up. The sound of the news report about Grant's arrest fading into the background. It's over, Sloan whispered. It was a promise fulfilled, but that victory hadn't been guaranteed. It had been built on a foundation of secrets and pain, laid one piece at a time. The final piece had been Meredith herself. When she woke up, her testimony was the key that locked his cage for good, a whispered account of the fall that was no accident at all. Yet, that final account was only possible because of the immense effort that came before it. It started with one woman's hope. Tell me everything, Sloan had urged Charlie, Meredith's friend, turning grief into action. Charlie, a nurse who saw the signs but felt powerless, finally had an outlet. She described how Grant micromanaged Meredith's life, her money, her friends, even her phone. She recalled the late-night visits, the unexplained bruises, and the fear in Meredith's eyes, the kind of fear that kept her from leaving for good. This conversation was the first crucial thread Sloane pulled, unraveling the tapestry of lies Grant had woven. Charlie had shown her pictures, heartbreaking smiles that didn't reach Meredith's eyes, and a posture of someone trying to hide. We all saw it, she'd admitted, and we all looked away. That shared guilt became a powerful weapon. "I need your help," Sloane had said, her voice steady. "Whatever you need," Charlie replied, her resolve hardening. That night, Sloane transformed a hotel room into a command center. A call to her partner, Derek, set the official gears in motion. "I've started digging," he'd reported, already uncovering buried settlements and suspicious employee departures at Ashford Industries. Derek had warned her of the risks. "Grant Ashford has powerful friends," he'd said. "If we go after him and miss, he'll destroy us." But Sloane's mind was on the unsent message on Meredith's phone. "He's going to kill me." There was no room for error. "I'm not going to miss," she had vowed, dedicating herself completely to the fight. Her promise was not just for Meredith, but for the ghosts of Grant's past. Women like Nina, who had been driven to the edge, their stories silenced. Sloane knew she was fighting an empire, but she had to try. The alternative was unthinkable. The weight of that empire had nearly crushed her. One night, alone in her hotel room at 3 a.m, despair had set in. Grant seemed too powerful, too well-connected. He'd been getting away with it for years. What made her think she could be the one to stop him? The thought of giving up, of just going home, was a heavy temptation. But a routine call to the hospital, a nurse's gentle update, "She's stable. The baby is stable," had been the spark she needed. Hope, however small, was still there. And with it, her promise to Meredith echoed in the dark. She had confronted him once before, at her mother's funeral reception. The memory was sharp. In the quiet of a study, Grant's mask of the charming husband had dropped. "You're going to fly back to Seattle, and you're never going to contact my wife again," he had ordered, his voice dripping with menace. When Sloane accused him of putting Meredith in a coma, he dismissed it as a tragic accident, the same story he told the police and doctors. His confidence was chilling, his ownership of her sister absolute. "She's mine," he'd said. "And nothing you do is going to change that." He'd left her with a veiled threat. "Go home, Sloane, before something tragic happens to you, too." The words hung in the air, leaving her trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. That night, she had locked herself in her hotel bathroom, barricading the door, and finally allowed herself to cry. The hopelessness was a physical weight. Grant was a monster, protected by wealth and a flawless public image. He was untouchable. It was in that moment, at her lowest point, that she made a decision. Before the threats, before she had any allies, there was just a cold, sinking suspicion. At the hospital, she had sat by Meredith's silent form, the ventilator's rhythmic whoosh, a constant reminder of what was at stake. She spoke to her sister, telling her stories, making a silent vow. "Grant thinks he's untouchable," she'd murmured, holding Meredith's limp hand. "But he's wrong. I'm going to find everything he's hiding, and I'm going to destroy him." It was a promise made in the quiet hum of machines, a declaration of war. With the click of handcuffs, it was finally over. Sloane watched Grant, his perfect smile gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury, as officers led him away. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, she felt a squeeze on her hand. Meredith's eyes were open, a flicker of the sister she once knew finally breaking through. 6 years of darkness were ending with a single, fragile beam of light. A whisper, weak but clear, filled the space between them. You came. Sloane held her sister's hand to her cheek, tears blurring the image she thought she'd never see again. I told you I would, she answered, always. It had all unraveled so quickly once the first thread was pulled. Detective Webb had appeared in the hospital hallway, his tired eyes holding a spark of suspicion. The case wasn't truly closed, he'd admitted. The official report, an accidental fall, just didn't sit right with the medical findings. The doctor's concerns had reached him. Webb spoke in a low voice, detailing the inconsistencies, the bruising patterns that told a different story, the history of previous fractures that screamed of a long-running nightmare. He explained that a formal investigation had been quietly reopened, waiting for one solid piece of evidence to blow it wide open. That final piece arrived by courier, a thick file containing the sworn statement of Paula Warren. Her story, documented with dates, times, and gut-wrenching details, was the key. It established Grant's pattern, a history of predation hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. Paula's words painted a picture of a man who didn't just hurt women, but methodically destroyed them. It was a story of manipulation, of a pregnancy used as a weapon, and of a career ruined to ensure silence. Her testimony wasn't just helpful, it was the stone that finally brought the giant down, giving voice to all the victims he thought he'd silenced forever. The whole crusade had started with a single phone call from that quiet hotel room, the memory of her sister's vacant stare fueling a cold rage. Sloane had known then that something had to change, that Meredith's desperate, unspoken message before the coma was a call to arms. She dialed Derek, her voice steady and hard. I need everything you can find on Grant Ashford, personal, professional, everything. It was the moment she stopped waiting for Meredith to save herself and started building the arsenal to do it for her. There would be no more polite questions, no more hoping for the best. It was time for war. Derek had hesitated for a moment, reminding her of the risks. Once we cross certain lines, we can't uncross them, he'd warned. Sloane hadn't flinched. Thinking of Meredith, lying broken in a hospital bed because of so-called accidents, she had given the order. Medical records. I need to know every hospital visit Meredith has made in the last 8 years. When he'd mentioned the legality, her response was immediate and sharp. I don't care about legally. I care about evidence. A photograph on the nightstand of 2 little girls in matching dresses was all the justification she needed. She was sure. She had spent hours by that hospital bed, holding her sister's still hand, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the only response. The memories of their childhood felt closer than ever. Do you remember, she'd said softly, when Dad would come home drunk? You were so scared, you'd hide under your bed with that stuffed rabbit. She painted the picture for the sister who couldn't hear her, recalling how she'd stand guard outside the bedroom door, a 10-year-old soldier promising a safety she couldn't possibly provide. It was a promise she had failed to keep, both then and now. Tears streamed down her face as she sat in the dim light. I couldn't protect you from Dad, and I couldn't protect you from Grant, but I'm going to fix that now. She squeezed Meredith's unresponsive hand, pouring all her strength, all her resolve, into that one touch. I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone ever again. Just hold on. Hold on for me and for your daughter. It was a vow made in the face of silence, a promise to rewrite an ending that had been terrifyingly similar to their beginning. She just needed her sister to survive long enough to see it. That beginning had started 6 years ago in the suffocating quiet of Grant's study after their mother's funeral. He'd turned to her with that perfect, polished smile, offering bourbon from a crystal decanter. But Sloane saw through it. I know what you are, she'd said, the words hanging in the tense air. The smile never left his lips, but his eyes went flat and cold. He didn't deny it. Instead, he twisted her concern into a weapon. "Your sister told me about your paranoia," he'd said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, claiming she was jealous, controlling, and had never approved of anyone Meredith dated. Just then, the door opened. Meredith stood there, her eyes darting between them, sensing the hostility. "What's going on?" she asked. Grant's voice instantly turned warm and loving. "Nothing, darling. Your sister and I were just getting to know each other." But Sloane pleaded with her sister. "Mare, can't you see it? He's manipulating you." Meredith's face hardened, her voice strained with exhaustion and grief. "Sloane, please." "Not today." Sloane pushed, desperate to break through the wall Grant had built. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" Meredith shot back, her voice rising. "From my husband who loves me?" With tears welling in her eyes, Meredith stepped forward, her words like daggers. "When's the last time you called?" "You send a text on my birthday." "That's it." Then came the final blow, the words Grant had so clearly coached her to say. "If you can't accept Grant, if you can't be happy for me, then maybe it's better if we take some time apart." As Sloane stared, speechless, Grant stood behind Meredith, a possessive hand on her shoulder, and met Sloane's eyes with a triumphant, silent smile. Defeated, Sloane walked out, leaving her sister in a prison she had chosen for herself. The memory came unbidden, the real reason she could never let go. Two small sisters, just 8 and 6, huddled together in the dark of a closet. Downstairs, their father raged, the sound of breaking glass and their mother's screams filtering through the door. Sloane had wrapped her tiny arms around Meredith, covering her ears, whispering stories of brave princesses who saved themselves. "I've got you," she had promised into her little sister's hair. "I'll always protect you." Meredith had looked up, her eyes wide and trusting. "Promise?" "I promise," Sloane had said. "Sisters forever." And that's how it was. That was the promise that had finally been kept. With the case officially closed, Detective Webb's hands were tied. But some things, he knew, couldn't be left to official channels. He saw the fire in Sloane's eyes and recognized a stubbornness that reminded him of someone he'd lost. "Grant Ashford has friends in high places," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "The mayor's office called the chief. The DA got a talking to from his golf buddy. They want this buried." Sloane's jaw was tight. "And you're just letting it go?" Webb shook his head slowly. "I didn't say that." He met her gaze. Sometimes unofficial work turns up the most interesting results. He knew what she needed. Something undeniable, a piece of evidence so solid it couldn't be swept away. "I might have a way to help," Sloane offered. He wasn't surprised. Handing her his personal number, he made it clear. "Anything you find comes to me. Not the station, just me." As she took the card, a fragile hope passing between them, she had to ask, "Well, why are you doing this?" Webb looked away for a moment, his voice thick with memory, when he finally spoke. "I had a sister," he said, the admission raw. "Different man, but the same story. She didn't survive." That was why, standing in the hospital hallway, Sloane felt an unshakable resolve as she watched Grant Ashford perform for an audience of one. He sat by his comatose wife's bed, whispering words she couldn't hear, his grip on Meredith's hand tightening just a little too much. His smile was a hollow mask. He was there for exactly 30 minutes before checking his watch, straightening his tie, and walking out without a single look back. His cold precision was the only clue Sloane needed. She tailed him from the hospital parking garage, her car a shadow, behind his gleaming Mercedes. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove through Hartford's affluent neighborhoods, heading toward a gritty industrial area by the river, finally pulling into the lot of a nondescript building. Sloan parked across the street and waited. An hour later, Grant came out with a younger, nervous-looking man. They exchanged a few words, a thick envelope, passed from the younger man to Grant. After a quick count of the contents, Grant nodded, and they both drove off into the night. That moment confirmed it for Sloan. This was bigger than domestic violence. Grant was hiding something else entirely. Her suspicions were validated that night when a package arrived from her friend Derek. It was filled with financial records and internal documents. The fruits of some very creative and deniable hacking. The files painted a damning picture of Ashford Industries systematically inflating defense contract costs for years. Millions were funneled through shell corporations to offshore accounts. Grant Ashford, worth over $200 million, had stolen at least half of it from the government. He's not just an abuser, Sloan whispered to herself. He's a world-class thief. She immediately called Derek. I need to get this to someone at the SEE, someone who can't be bought. Derek had just the person, an old contact from his bureau's days, who owed him one. As she hung up, Sloan stared at the evidence spread across her hotel room. Grant had built an empire on lies and brutality, and she was about to bring it crashing down. But first, she had to face the queen of that empire. A summons had brought her to the Ashford estate, a 50-acre fortress of stone walls and iron gates. A housekeeper led her through her marble halls, filled with portraits of long-dead Ashfords, a gallery of cold, privileged faces. In a sitting room that cost more than Sloane's life savings, Vivian Ashford, Grant's mother, was waiting. She was the picture of old money, with perfectly coiffed hair and pearls, ruling her family with an iron fist veiled in Hermes silk. Miss Callahan, she said, gesturing to a seat. Sloane stayed on her feet. What do you want? Vivian's smile was as brittle as fine china. I'm told you've been asking questions, making accusations that are upsetting my son. Her eyes were like chips of ice. I'm here to tell you to stop. Sloane didn't flinch. And if I refuse? Vivian's smile vanished. Our family has considerable resources, legal, political, personal. I would hate to see them turned against you. Sloane stepped closer, her voice low and steady. Your son put his pregnant wife in a coma. He has been hurting her for years, and you want me to look away? Marriages can be difficult, Vivian countered, her composure absolute. That is a private matter. The medical evidence can be interpreted in many ways. She took a delicate sip of tea. My son is a good man, a pillar of this community. Your sister is lucky to be his wife. The word lucky sent a surge of fury through Sloane. She's in a coma. A tragic accident, Vivian said dismissively. You are not welcome here, Miss Callahan. I suggest you go back to Seattle before things get uncomfortable. In the taut silence that followed, Sloane made a promise. I'm not going anywhere, and when this is done, your son will be in prison, and your precious family name will be nothing but mud. As she walked out, Vivian's voice followed her, a cold, deadly warning. You have no idea what you're up against. But Sloane already had her next move planned. She found Theodore Ashford, Grant's younger brother, drinking alone in a downtown bar. He was the family weak link, a man who had lived his entire life in his brother's terrifying shadow. Go away, Theo slurred. I'm not interested. Sloane slid into the booth opposite him. I want to talk about what you tried to do for Meredith 3 years ago. Theo froze, his drunken haze evaporating. Charlie told me, Sloane pressed gently. You told her to leave him. You offered to help her escape, and Grant found out. His voice was a bare whisper. He broke my arm. He told everyone I fell off a horse. Theo drained his glass, the shame heavy in his eyes. I've watched my brother destroy people. My whole life, I never did a thing. You were afraid, Sloane said. I'm still afraid, he confessed, desperation creeping into his voice. Last week, He showed me pictures of my kids at school. He didn't have to say a word. The chilling revelation confirmed what Sloan suspected. Grant wasn't just violent. He was a sociopath who used his family as pawns. I need your help, Theo. He's going to keep hurting people until somebody stops him. Meredith is in a coma because no one was brave enough to speak up. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He was quiet for a long time. The bar's cheerful noise a world away from the dark conversation in their booth. Finally, he looked at her, his decision made. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Tell me about the business," Sloan said. "The shell companies, the financial irregularities." Theo's face went white. "How do you know about that?" "I know a lot," she replied. "But I need someone on the inside." After another tense pause, Theo leaned in, his hands trembling. "There's a safe in his office at home, hidden behind a portrait of our grandfather," he whispered. "That's where he keeps the real records, the ones he doesn't want anyone to see." Getting to them seemed impossible. "The house is like Fort Knox," he said, "but there's a charity event next week." His words were the key Sloan needed, the opportunity that would eventually allow her to stand over Grant's ruined empire. But before that victory, she had to endure his final, desperate attempts to control her. Her allies began to disappear one by one, silenced by Grant's power. Then he came for her directly, appearing at her hotel room late one evening, his smile confident and chilling. "May I come in?" he asked. "No." He leaned against the doorframe, unbothered. "I wanted to give you one last chance to walk away from this." The flash of cameras was blinding as Grant Ashford was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs. Sloan stood with the other women, a silent, unbreakable line of them, watching the mask of the perfect husband finally crumble. Paula and Linda were there, tears streaming down their faces, but these were tears of release. Detective Webb gave Sloan a single, solemn nod. It was over. He couldn't buy his way out of this one. The fortress he had built around himself had been torn down, brick by painful brick. This moment of justice was paid for in blood. It hadn't been the first flash drive, or the financial records, that had sealed his fate. It was the second one, Nina's drive. After Nina's supposed suicide, Sloan had torn apart her apartment, driven by a cold fury. Taped under a drawer, she found it. It contained everything. Every threat, every illegal deal, every act of violence Grant had ever recorded to protect himself. He had created the weapon of his own destruction, and Nina had died putting it in Sloan's hands. That victory felt impossible just weeks earlier, standing in the cold rain at Nina Castillo's funeral. Sloan watched Grant play the part of the grieving boss, even shedding a crocodile tear. Their eyes met over the fresh grave, and he smiled, a chilling, confident smile that said, "I won." In that instant, something inside Sloan turned to steel. Nina had been murdered for trying to help, for her bravery. Grant thought it was the end, but for Sloan, it was a promise. She would not let her sacrifice be for nothing. She turned from the grave, leaving the rain and his hollow victory behind. She had work to do. Before Nina's death, Grant's counterattack had been swift and brutal. The SEC investigation suddenly hit a wall of procedural issues, effectively burying it. James Whitmore, the board member who had agreed to help, vanished on an indefinite vacation, his office wiped clean. Paula received a veiled threat at her job. And Theo, her one link inside the family, went silent after a picture of his children at school arrived on his phone. The message was clear. Every door Sloan had opened was slammed shut in her face. Grant's power was immense, a fortress built on money and fear, as Detective Webb had warned her. "Someone's been cleaning up after him for years," he'd said, over coffee one night, explaining how reports vanished and witnesses recanted their stories. The system was rigged in Grant's favor, and with Meredith still in a coma, the doctors talking about delivering the baby, time was running out. A case for assault, without the victim's testimony, was nearly impossible. "We need to move faster," Sloan had insisted, the exhaustion feeling like a physical weight. But they had built a powerful case before it all fell apart. There was strength and solidarity. 3 women, Paula, Linda, and another, all former employees, all silenced by NDAs and threats, had agreed to testify together. "He made us feel like we were the crazy ones," Linda had said, her voice trembling after 5 years of carrying the shame. Sloan had assured them, "That's what abusers do. None of this was your fault." Together, they resolved to take back the lives he had tried to destroy. The foundation of this case began with James Whitmore, a distinguished board member at Grant's company. He met her in a quiet coffee shop, his face pale as Sloan laid out the financial documents from the safe. "My God," he'd whispered, "this is massive. Over $23 million siphoned through shell companies." Whitmore, whose mentor had once helped Meredith, knew he had to act. He promised to contact people at the SEC he trusted, people who couldn't be bought. "This is going to get ugly before it gets better," he warned. He had no idea how right he was. It all started with what she found on that first flash drive. She had watched the security footage 3 times, each viewing like swallowing glass. It showed Grant, drunk and enraged, chasing Meredith to the top of the stairs. It showed him grab her, spin her around, and push. He stood there for 32 seconds, watching his pregnant wife lie crumpled at the bottom. Then, he calmly walked down, stepped over her body, and called 911, his voice the perfect pitch of a worried husband. That video was the heart of it all. She'd gotten that drive by slipping away from a charity gala at the estate. While 500 guests mingled under crystal chandeliers, Sloan found the study on the 2nd floor, just as Theo had described. The safe was behind a painting of a stern-faced grandfather, an old model with a simple combination lock. Cracking it took her less than 5 minutes. Inside were documents, account numbers, and the flash drive. She photographed everything, pocketed the drive, and was almost out the door when it opened. It was Grant. "The bathroom is downstairs," he said, his voice pleasant as he stepped into the room and closed the door. "You're a terrible liar, Sloan, just like your sister." Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice even. He moved closer, a predator stalking his prey, telling her that whatever she thought she'd found would disappear. "Is that a threat?" she asked. "It's a promise," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Tragic accidents happen all the time." He smiled his perfect smile and left her alone, trembling, but with the evidence still clutched in her hand. All of this, the risk and the fear, began with a desperate plea. It was Theo, Grant's own brother, who had sought her out. He told her about the black tie gala, how the study would be empty, and asked if she could get an invitation. "If he finds out, he'll kill me," she had said, the madness of the idea sinking in. "He won't find out," Theo promised. "And when this is over, you'll be free of him too." He looked at her, hope and fear warring in his eyes. "Sisters forever," he'd murmured. "That's what Meredith used to say about you. She said you were the bravest person she knew, that you always kept your promises." And in that moment, she knew she had to try. "That's not happening," she said. He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It was filled with photos of her, at the gala, meeting with her contacts, watching him in the parking garage. "I watch everyone," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. His mistake was thinking surveillance was the same as control. He couldn't see the network she had built in the shadows he created, the trap that was already closing around him. He saw a woman alone. He didn't see the detective, the hacker, and the broken brother standing with her, and he certainly didn't see justice coming. That war began with a quiet conversation. A Dr. Thornton had pulled Sloane aside. "There's nothing I can do officially," she'd said, "but I thought you should know." She spoke of Meredith's previous injuries, the patterns that pointed to something far more sinister than clumsiness. Her words confirmed the dark thoughts Sloane had been trying to suppress. They were the first flicker of light in the darkness, the first piece of truth in a mountain of deception. "I hope when she does wake up, things are different," the doctor had said. "They will be," Sloane had replied, her voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." When she walked out of that consultation, Grant was waiting, his face a perfect mask of concern. He played the part of the grieving husband flawlessly, speaking of how much Meredith missed her, how he had encouraged her to reach out. He walked beside her, his presence a suffocating lie. Sloane stopped, turning to face him, the cold calm she used for cross-examination settling over her. "Let's be clear about something, Grant," she had said, her voice cutting through his charade. "I know what you are." His smile never wavered, but a flicker in his eyes gave him away. "My sister is lying in that room because of you," she continued, "and when she wakes up, everything is going to change." He had dismissed her words as the ramblings of a grieving sister, citing the police investigation and the official story of a terrible accident. That was when Sloane knew, without a doubt, that a fight was coming, and so it began. With sunlight spilling into her room, Sloane woke to a profound calm that had settled deep in her bones after years of turmoil. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Meredith asking her over for brunch, insisting that Hope was demanding to see her aunt. Sloane smiled, got ready, and drove through the Seattle morning to her sister's home. At the door, Meredith held Hope, who reached out immediately, her small fingers wrapping around Sloane's. "Someone missed you," Meredith said. Sloane gathered the baby into her arms, the solid, warm weight of the little life she'd helped to save. "I missed her, too." The kitchen smelled of butter and maple syrup from the pancakes Meredith had made. They decided right there to make it a tradition. Sunday brunch, every single week, a constant in their lives, so Hope would grow up truly knowing her aunt. "I'm so proud of you," Sloane said, looking at the strong, brave woman her sister had become. Meredith's eyes welled up. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Sloane shook her head. "You could have. That message you tried to send, that was you saving yourself. I just helped you finish." They had lived, not a fairy tale happily ever after, but something real and whole. Together, sisters forever. Hope was just 9 months old when she took her first steps, tottering on unsteady legs between her mother and her aunt. When she tumbled into Sloane's arms, Meredith cried tears of pure joy. "She's going to be trouble," Sloane laughed, holding the squirming baby. "Good," Meredith replied, taking her daughter back. "I want her to be trouble. I want her to fight back and never, ever be quiet when someone hurts her." That strength had been hard won. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Meredith confessed something. "I used to think strength meant not needing anyone," she said softly, watching Hope play. "Being independent, never asking for help. But that's not strength. That's just being alone." She paused, looking at her daughter, then at her sister. True strength, she had learned, was found in a love that was more powerful than fear. It was having someone who wouldn't let you go, not ever again. But before this peace, there was the day of the reckoning. James Whitmore had called an emergency board meeting. As the 12 members settled around the mahogany table, Grant Ashford sat at its head, oblivious and in control. "Before we begin," Whitmore announced, "there's a matter that requires immediate attention." On cue, the doors opened. Sloane walked in, followed by Detective Webb and 6 other women, their faces etched with grim determination. Grant's confident mask flickered for just a second. "What is this? This is a private meeting," he blustered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Not anymore," Sloan said, placing a packet of evidence in front of every board member. The rustle of turning pages filled the silence. She laid out the truth for all to see. 10 years of financial fraud, $23 million siphoned from government contracts through a web of shell companies. But the crimes went far deeper than money. For years, she's tried to ruin my family with these manufactured lies and games. If that's true, you won't mind watching this. Sloan gave a nod to Detective Webb, who plugged a laptop into the conference room monitor. The screen lit up. The kitchen, Grant walking in, Meredith stepping back. The slap, the punch, the chase, the fall. 32 seconds of Grant staring at his wife at the foot of the stairs before his voice, calm and controlled, called for an ambulance. The room fell silent. Board members looked at the screen, horrified. Some glanced away, but others couldn't look away from the scene. Grant's composure finally shattered. "That footage is fake. It's been edited. This is a setup. The video was pulled from your own security system," Detective Webb stated, "along with years of other recordings that reveal a history of abuse and illegal activities." "Grant Ashford," Webb's voice turned formal, official, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The officers started to approach. "This is a mistake," Grant said, backing up. "I'm Grant Ashford. Do you have any idea who I know? I will have your job. I'll have all of your jobs. Feel free to try," Webb said, motioning to his officers. "Cuff him." The handcuffs snapped shut. Grant was escorted through the room, past board members who avoided his gaze, past the women he'd tormented for years, and past Sloan, who stood like a statue. He paused in front of her, leaning in. "This isn't finished," he whispered. "You don't know what you've started." "I kept my promise," Sloan answered softly. "That's all that counts." And then he was led away. The story erupted within hours. CEO arrested for attempted murder and fraud. Ashford Industries, stock, tanked. 6 women came forward, alleging abuse. The press descended in a frenzy, with cameras posted outside the courthouse and reporters chasing down anyone tied to the case. The story was just too massive, too scandalous, too perfect. Grant Ashford, the golden child of Connecticut high society, exposed as a monster. Sloan dodged the cameras, having no desire to be part of the media circus. Her only concern was Meredith. 3 days after the arrest, Meredith was awake and speaking. The ventilator was out. Her voice was faint, hoarse after weeks of silence, but she could talk, could comprehend, and could finally share her side of the story. Detective Webb recorded her statement, speaking with a gentle patience, and giving her all the time she needed. "He was so charming at first," Meredith said, her gaze lost in the past. "So charming. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world. By the time I saw his true colors, I was already stuck." "When did the violence begin?" "It was gradual, so gradual I barely saw it coming. A little criticism here, a jab there, isolating me from my family, my friends." She looked over at Sloan. "My sister, did you ever attempt to get away?" "Once. He located me in less than a day, brought me home, and swore it would never happen again." Meredith's voice grew firm. "It did happen again. It always did. Can you describe the night of the incident?" Meredith shut her eyes, taking a long breath. "He got home furious, accusing me of telling his brother about the business, about his secrets. Her hand rested on her belly. The baby kicked. He struck me. I ran. He cornered me by the stairs. Did he push you?" "Yes." The word was a faint whisper. "He grabbed my shoulders, looked me straight in the eye, and shoved. And then I was falling. Thank you, Mrs. Ashford. That's all for now. The trial started 4 months later. By that time, Meredith had delivered a healthy baby girl. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, born 3 weeks premature, but perfectly healthy. She named her Hope. Hope Callahan. Not Ashford. Never again. The trial was a spectacle, with every seat in the courtroom taken and reporters lined up outside, the whole country tuned in. Grant entered a not guilty plea, naturally. His defense team claimed it was a setup, that the evidence was faked, a family grudge. But the proof was undeniable, the video, the financial trails, and the testimonies of what were now 8 women. 2 more had come forward after seeing the others show their courage. Meredith took the stand. On day 12, she entered the courtroom, wearing a plain black dress, no makeup or jewelry. She looked right at Grant as she was sworn in. He met her gaze, that same cold smile on his lips, but his eyes were different, empty, beaten. Meredith shared her story, every detail. 8 years of abuse, how it got worse, the loneliness, the terror that was always with her. I believed him when he said, "No one would ever believe me," she stated, her voice steady and powerful now. I believed him when he said I deserved it. I believed him when he told me I had nowhere else to turn. What was the turning point? The prosecutor asked. Meredith looked to Sloane in the front row. My sister came back, and she helped me remember I wasn't alone, that I never had to be. Grant's attorney tried to paint her as a liar, confused and manipulated by her sister. Meredith stood her ground. I know what happened to me. I know what he did. I have the scars to prove it. Her eyes locked with Grant's one last time, and I am not scared of him anymore. The jury returned its verdict on day 18. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder in the first degree, 15 counts of fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of assault and harassment. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the charges could mean up to 40 years. Grant was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. No smile this time, no facade, just the vacant look of a man seeing his world collapse. Sloane watched him leave before turning to her sister and pulling her into a hug. "It's over," she whispered. "It's finally done." Meredith clung to her, shaking and crying, but for the first time in 8 years, they were tears of relief. 6 months after that, Grant Ashford received a sentence of 40 years in federal prison without parole. During the hearing, 7 of the women he had abused read their victim impact statements. One after another, they stood before him, looking him in the eye as they detailed everything he had stolen from them. Meredith was the last to speak. "You told me I was nothing without you, that nobody would ever believe me, that I should be thankful you picked me." Her voice echoed, sharp and clear, through the hushed courtroom. "You were wrong about every single thing. I am not nothing. I am strong. I am brave. I survived you. And now I am going to live the rest of my life in freedom while you waste away in a cell." Grant remained silent, just staring at the table. The judge handed down the sentence. 40 years, the maximum penalty. Justice had finally arrived. Flawed, incomplete, but justice all the same. Vivian Ashford fled to Europe soon after the verdict. Rumors said she was in a villa in the south of France. Others claimed she was hiding out in Switzerland. Regardless, she never set foot in Connecticut again. The Ashford mansion was sold off, with the proceeds given to Grant's victims in a civil case. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was something. Theodore Ashford started going to therapy. He mailed Meredith a card after the trial ended. It said, "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I'm trying to be now." Meredith read it over twice before putting it in a drawer. Forgiveness was a long way off, but maybe, someday, it could happen. Meredith and Hope relocated to Seattle. Sloane set them up in a house with a large yard and 2 bedrooms with space to grow. It was close to her own apartment, so she could stop by daily. Charlie moved too, taking a nursing position at a nearby hospital. The 3 women forged their own kind of family. "This isn't what I pictured," Meredith said. "There's also evidence," Sloane continued, her voice steady as she met Grant's furious gaze, "of criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and the assault of multiple employees." She let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow, and attempted murder. His protests that she was just a disgruntled sister-in-law sounded hollow and desperate. The wheels of justice had begun to turn because she had received a package a few weeks earlier. Inside that package was a flash drive and a note in the careful handwriting of a woman named Nina. "I knew he would find out eventually," she had written. "I knew what would happen, but I wanted to do something right. Use it. Make him pay for all of us." It was Nina's secret insurance policy, years of secretly recorded phone calls and conversations, a chronicle of Grant's corruption she had compiled, waiting for the day she would need it. It's letting people in, trusting them again, even when it's scary, even after you've been hurt. She looked at Sloane. It's choosing to connect instead of playing it safe. It's believing love is worth the gamble. Sloane thought about all they had endured, the years apart, the abuse, the coma, the legal battle. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Those 6 years we didn't speak?" "Every single day," Meredith's voice wavered. "But I can't rewrite the past. All I can do is make a better future. For Hope. For me." She smiled. "For us. Sisters forever. Sisters forever." That night, Sloane had a dream about their childhood. 2 little girls huddled in a closet, the older one covering her sister's ears, telling her stories of brave princesses who saved themselves, but in her dream, the tale had a new ending. The princess didn't wait around for a prince. She rescued herself, with her sister by her side, finding a courage she never knew she possessed. After a call from Nina's sister, Sloane had listened to it all, taking notes, piecing together the conspiracy. She heard Grant discussing how to make harassment complaints vanish and arranging payments to a city councilman. Armed with this undeniable proof, she had contacted the other victims. "I know you're scared," she'd told them, "but I have real evidence now." One by one, women with scars and stories of their own had agreed to stand together. They had nothing left to lose. The most chilling recording, the one that started it all, was from the night before Meredith's fall. "She's been talking to my brother," Grant's voice snarled, "asking questions about the finances. If she doesn't stop, I'll have to do something about it." An unfamiliar voice asked what kind of something. "Whatever is necessary," Grant replied. "She's my wife. She belongs to me." And so it was revealed. The entire nightmare began with a terrified woman trying to send a message, and a sister who had made a promise to protect her, no matter the cost. As she drew them into a laughing hug, it dawned on Sloane. This is what healing was. Not pain vanishing, but connection growing, the love of people who always show up. She'd made a promise to her sister 24 years ago, huddled in a closet as their father's anger shook the house. "I will always protect you." That promise had survived years of distance, silence, and hurt, but she had kept it, and she would for the rest of their lives. If this story moved you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up for a loved one? Or discovered a strength you didn't realize you possessed? Share it with our community. Your story might be the one someone needs to hear today. And for more tales of courage, justice, and the power of doing what's right, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. We bring you new stories weekly. each one designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own inner power. Thank you for being here, and thank you for listening. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.